Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Israel at War update. And as we continue to deliberate the various developments here in Israel, throughout the region and beyond, it's always important to remember that 210 days ago, the Islamist terror groups from the Hamas-plagued Gaza Strip launched an onslaught on southern Israel, declaring war by perpetrating a massacre, murdering some 1,200, mostly civilians, wounding over 4,800 others, and kidnapping 246 individuals, including elderly men, women, children, and infants. 133 of them remain in Hamas captivity to date. Let's now turn to TV7's editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, on the one hand, there is a necessity to eradicate the Islamist Hamas to ensure that the atrocities committed on October 8th and the subsequent couple of days will never reoccur. For that, the ground offensive into Rafah may be necessary in order to ensure that at least the 4 remaining battalions that are an organized terrorist army pretty much will be eradicated, and the activities subsequent to that will ensure that Hamas would never again rear its ugly head within that specific territory. But on the other hand, we have still 133, mostly civilians, in Hamas captivity, probably in Rafah, and Israel is scrambling to try and extricate them, rescue them in one way or another, of course. But right now, there is a deal on the table. Where are we?
So, Jonathan, here we are on the last day of the 30th week of the war, 30 weeks, 210 days. The end, the very end, is not yet in sight. And you presented the dilemma that the Israeli cabinet must decide on. But I'm not sure you used the right word when you talked about the Rafah option. The other option, yes, the hostage deal. But you used the word never. And never say never in this case. Who knows how long either Hamas or some replacement will need in order to transform itself and pose another threat another time. So Israel is probably aiming at a more modest achievement, that is of taking down whatever armed threat there is in and out of the Gaza Strip for several years. Of course, the longer, the better. Now, whether the 4 battalions and 1 brigade headquarters in the Rafah area can be broken, can you break the will of your enemy or only its capability, is an open question. And it seems that the Israeli Defense Forces are not too keen on carrying out this mission as long as there is a chance of bringing home the hostages through negotiation. Of course, they will execute any lawful order given, but their preference is to get the hostages out. And as we are looking at the situation in Gaza right now, the core issues of the war seem to be in abeyance, in suspense right now. There is some peripheral fighting. There are strikes from the air or sniper fire, some artillery or tank fire. But most of the effort is being concentrated on getting the aid from Jordan to the Erez passage, which is the northern one, or the construction of the corridor, the land corridor from the Israeli border to the Mediterranean, where it should link up with the pier, which is scheduled to be ready in several days' time. And the IDF is now also involved in a reshuffle in its high command, with several key positions being announced, several brigadier generals up for promotion, including the director of military intelligence and the commanding general of the Central Command. which is in charge of Judea and Samaria. So we are all waiting for Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader, to respond to the proposal which is on the table, which the US administration has given Israel credit for. But until this response is coming, everything else is on hold.
Indeed. Well, when I said never, I meant never. And I think that I'm in the correct zone of what never again actually means. But ultimately, in order to ensure that it will never happen, it's an ongoing push, it's an ongoing activity, and not to rely on misconceptions that unfortunately has brought about October 7th to begin with, not qualitative tools or anything of that sort, but rather the clear understanding that a dynamic threat is something that can be contended with as long as you maintain it at bay. But let's now turn to the commander of the Israeli Air Force Task Force for Air and Missile Defense, namely Brigadier General in Reserve Doron Gavish. General Gavish, I'd like to ask you with regard to on the one hand, military necessity to degrade Hamas to the point where it will never hold once again territory within either the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, particularly also in other locations beyond the bounds of Israel, but we will leave those two territories right now within our scope of discussion. And along that, also the necessity to rescue the 133 hostages. Is there a conflict in this situation at this point in time?
Well, as it was mentioned, at this point of time, we are all in hold, kind of waiting to decide the government decision, basically, what would be the next step. Of course, from the IDF point of view, the IDF is ready. The IDF has been ready for quite a long time. When we talk about it purely from a military point of view, those are very challenging times. When you are study with your forces, basically it's a military disadvantage. So as a military, you don't like to be in this position, and the IDF is quite a while in this position, and this is going back to the question of if there is a tension between the goals of those war. Of course, there is a tension, but the idea is really to be very smart and not only to be right. And if this is the cost of let's wait a bit to see if we could have something better by other means, not only the military means. This is something that should be done. Of course, in general, it is. We talk about it more than once, and the story is not only the military one. The question of the day after is around the corner, and if it is a military solution, pure military solution, so in order to keep the area as much as you can clean from terrorism, clean from the Hamas to go back, you have to be there. You have to fully be engaged in all the area, and this is the military solution. We're not sure that this is what we want. We want another solution probably that won't be exhausting too much of our divisions, soldiers that would need to be in this area, and this is really something that the IDF is talking about openly, that the day after it is something that needs to be discussed, and as fast as we can do it, the better.
Well, let's now turn to London, the United Kingdom, where we're joined by retired Colonel Joel Rayburn, formerly a senior director at the National Security Council for Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, as well as a U.S. Special Envoy for Syria, among others. It's good to see you, Colonel. I'd like to ask you about this concept of the day after, the whole discussion that keeps coming about. When we're talking about, if I may analogize here, about Operation Inherent Resolve in Syria and Iraq, the U.S.-led coalition was tasked with eradicating the Islamic State, Dawlat Islam bil Ard al-Sham, Iraq, and we're looking at a terrorist organization that was capable of gaining substantive swathes of territory, deprived of those lands very effectively, if I may add. And now there is an open ended operation that just basically focuses on ensuring that this Islamist radical group will not rear its ugly head once more and regain lost territories. Would such an analogy be legitimate to equate it to the IDF's activities in the Gaza Strip and the necessity, first and foremost, to ensure that Hamas no longer holds any territory, and then subsequently to open endedly, detached completely from the political and policy objectives of this mission, continue to ensure that this terrorist organization does not regain territory in future circumstances?
Well, I think it is a good analogy. Not only that, I think the U.S. led coalition experience, not just in Iraq but also in Afghanistan and Syria, is instructive, and it points to a couple of things, as you mentioned. In order to truly defeat a terrorist group that has become an army in the field and even and hold territory and govern territory, you have to first and foremost, the first step is you have to deprive that group of the territory that it can use to collect revenues, a strategic depth from which to launch attacks. It can recruit from the population and so on. That's what the ISIS caliphate was in Syria and Iraq. That's what the Taliban emirate was in Afghanistan, and so on. So you have to rob it of the territory, but then at that point, these groups all revert to being clandestine terrorist networks or guerrilla insurgencies, and then you have to defeat them on that level too. When you get to that point, you can't succeed in that if there's a political vacuum and a governance vacuum and an economic vacuum. There has to be something to fill the vacuum, or else these forces they'll go into a clandestine level, and then they'll regenerate their strength, and then they will eventually come back. They may not succeed and may not come back as strong as before, but you can't snuff them out as long as there's not a political authority. So, in other words, in order to stabilize the territory that they were controlling, there has to be a political authority. There has to be a functioning economy, and there has to be something to fill the security vacuum. That's very, very difficult to do. In Iraq, that was done by essentially re-empowering the Iraqi state, the institutions of the Iraqi government. That didn't work. That didn't work completely well, because many of those institutions then became hijacked by another kind of terrorist organizations and the Iranian-sponsored militants. But in Afghanistan, I think you can look and see when the Taliban state collapsed in 2001 and 2002, they reverted to a clandestine network and then had safe havens in Pakistan. And there never was a properly stable and functioning Afghan government that could exert political control and security control and have a functioning economy in those Afghan territories. And eventually the Taliban, with Pakistani sponsorship, came right back. And we that happened over and over again at a micro level in Iraq. And it could potentially happen in Syria too, especially in the territories that the Assad regime not only controls but can't really secure. So I think that the same principle, the same factors will apply in Gaza. If there's not a stable political authority or stable political arrangement, if there's not a security force that's not Hamas that can fill the security vacuum, and if there's not a functioning economy, then that'll be a vacuum, that'll be oxygen for Hamas or Islamic Jihad or whoever, some future Hamas 2.0 or Islamic Jihad 2.0. Will be able to use to breathe and eventually come back again. And in the same way that the U.S. military had to go in to some areas in Iraq over and over again, but never actually snuff out Al Qaeda in Iraq until the tribal awakening filled the political vacuum and the security vacuum. If you look, all the times that you got the IDF has had to go into Gaza in the past, including in 2008, 2009, there never was anything to fill the vacuum in the wake of those military operations. So you'll be watching sitting through the same movie again, with the same outcome if it doesn't happen now. And that's the big dilemma, because what do you fill the political vacuum with? With the economic vacuum, you can kind of fill, although it can't function without a political authority and the security vacuum filled. But without filling that political vacuum and security vacuum, you just be right back in the same boat in a matter of weeks, months, or years.
Brilliant. I would like to ask you, Mr. Owen. Obviously, the Afghanistan situation is a very interesting analogy to study, considering the fact that the government that was placed there, of course, with the support of the United States, ultimately failed miserably when there was a entire withdrawal, where the Taliban once again regained their control over that country. And if we're looking at Iraq, with the United States still present there within an advisory capacity and various arrangements and agreements, of course, the Iranians, which is very similar to the situation in Gaza, in Lebanon, and elsewhere, still hold very significant sway, as Colonel Rayburn just mentioned, via its proxies, namely Hashtashabi and the various militias that are currently operating within that sphere. What can Israel, though, do in order to ensure that such a reality does not reoccur in the Gaza Strip, particularly at a time when the Palestinian Authority, which obviously is controlled by Fatah, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, has lost support not only in the Gaza Strip, where it failed to secure the Legislative Council in 2004, and subsequently also has not managed to secure more popularity, and therefore pushed back on any attempts to once again hold elections to resume control in that territory, and also in Judea, Samaria, the Jordan Valley, in areas under its own control. The Islamist Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the clans there are looking elsewhere. They're not looking to Fatah or the Palestinian Authority at that, and therefore, can one rely on that alternative absent other opportunities? Is this the best we can do?
No, if you're talking about total reliance, of course not. And one can add to the Afghanistan and Iraq and other analogies, which both you and Colonel Rayburn mentioned. You can, of course, add to that the British experience in Malaya and in East Africa, and the French experience in Algeria, and several other instances. Now, in the late 50s and up until 1967, Israel had the best optimal security situation it ever had on the Palestinian front, both in Gaza under Egyptian military rule and in the West Bank under Jordanian annexation. But this is, of course, water under the Jordan River bridges. The best or least worst outcome we can hope for is some combination of the so-called Dayton battalions, that is the security organizations of the Palestinian Authority, as trained and equipped and maintained by the US, and Israeli overwatch. Of course, if you leave the Palestinians to their own devices, they will not do a perfect job. But some combination of intelligence given back and forth and the Israeli capacity to strike, to raid, detain, strike, perhaps this is better than the other alternatives.
General Gavish, is such a presumed outcome viable in current climates with so much international pressure, particularly also from the United States pushing for the Palestinian Authority, demanding reform, and then subsequently not really seeing any reform other than getting the deputy prime minister to assume the role of prime minister at a time when, just couple of years ago, Palestinian Authority Prime Minister at the time, caretaker Rami Hamdallah, traveled to the Gaza Strip to have consultations with his counterparts in Hamas, and on his way back to Ramallah, he was the subject of an attempted assassination. Can we expect something to be revisited in a situation where Hamas would go down into the underground and start targeting not only Israel from within, but also its rivals within the Palestinian climate?
Well, Jonathan, you're just pointing out the challenges that we have in this area. It is not that you have some novel organization that would go into the Gaza Strip and would take care of everything and everything would be okay. By the way, we also have to remember that the people in the Gaza Strip, the majority of them, they support Hamas and until today. So it makes it even more complicated because those people need to, wanting someone else to come and rule them. And I'm not sure that this is what they want. So it is super complicated. And probably the best way to do it is to kind of find the first stage, the second stage, the third stage, and see how things could be done. Israel might need to do some, we might have to compromise on some of those things of what exactly it means, the ultimate win when we're talking about the Gaza Strip. And so it is very complicated, as we said. Of course, from again, going back to the military pure point of view, Israel must have this ability in order that it would be able at least to stop in some extent the terrorist organization to come back, is to be able to go in and out, to do whatever is necessary to take down those terrorists, but it is super complex.
Indeed. Colonel Rayburn, I'd like to ask you particularly, since Hamas currently is unwilling to enter into an arrangement with Israel over its proposal, since it demands basically that the war would end the moment a ceasefire takes effect. We heard Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Foreign Secretary of State from the United Kingdom, David Cameron, as well as others come out and say that the moment a ceasefire is adopted, they would work upon that to then enforce a permanent ceasefire, something that the Egyptians are trying to sell to Hamas as a point of reference, that any ceasefire would then be indeed extended without necessary assurances, since the international pressure on Israel would be so vast that Israel would not be able to restart the engines of war. Do you see that as something legitimate to point out, or is that just a way of negotiating with a terrorist organization with its back against a wall?
Well, it depends on how you define the problem that Israel and the rest of the region is facing. Is this a Hamas and Gaza problem only? Or is this a problem of the entire Iranian-sponsored axis of resistance in a regional conflict, and actually interventions beyond the region, such as the Iranian regime's intervention in the Ukraine war, and the war that's going on right now against commercial shipping in some of the world's most important strategic waterways? So if it's just a Gaza and Hamas problem, then this is more of a tactical set of decisions, and then there can be room for negotiation. But if the Gaza conflict is just a symptom of a larger Iranian regime-sponsored onslaught against the rest of the region, then ceasefires are meaningless, and sort of border ceasefires and arrangements on the Lebanese Israeli border are meaningless, won't last. If this is a problem of the Iranian regime, then you have to handle the problem of the Iranian regime in order for any of these local crises to be resolved.
Mr. Oren, this is a problem of the Iranian regime. It is pulling the strings. It is funding the organizations. It's making sure that whatever pressure points are facing somewhat of a resistance, other pressure points are applied throughout the region, going from, as Colonel Rayburn mentioned, the Red Sea all the way to Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and elsewhere. Well, what needs to be done in order to once again reinvigorate a decisive approach that would deter the Iranians from committing those atrocities?
You know, in almost 76 years of statehood, Israel never had a day without hostility from somewhere. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran. So the war with a capital W is not going to end anyway. One campaign in such a war can be suspended or even declared over. There are battles in a campaign and campaigns in a war, and it would take some clever legal minds to put in the loopholes which Israel, after getting the hostages back, can exploit once, for instance, a Hamas terrorist tries to blow up a checkpoint or a bus in Jerusalem. Even though it's not Gaza, Israel would still retain the right to respond wherever Hamas is. And the same goes for Iran. If Iran uses a proxy, Israel has the right to respond anywhere it wants, including in Tehran.
General Gavish, final sentence?
Well, you know what? Let's hope that we would see the hostages, at least this, at home as soon as we can. We have to remember there are still 133 hostages in the Gaza Strip, and fortunately, a large number of them are not alive anymore. So at least let's get back. Let's see those that are there. Let's see them being back into their families. And I agree with Amir that this is probably it is not something that is going to end tomorrow. It's going to take time in our region. It's unfortunate, but we have to understand it. So at least let's see them back.
This is absolutely not over. Colonel Rayburn, last sentence from you.
Hope for a peaceful weekend. That's all. That's all I can say.
Fair enough. Well, with that, I'd like to thank Colonel Rayburn, General Gavish, and Mr. Oren for your insights. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next update from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.
Shalom, I'm Danny Ayalon, former Israeli ambassador to the United States, former deputy foreign minister and member of Knesset. Today, I'm very privileged to be hosting TV7's Middle East Review and also being a panelist of the various shows of TV7, which I find the most enlightening, most educating if you really want to understand the world, the global scene as well as the regional scene of the Middle East. It is worthwhile to watch TV7.